You can't marry all three of us, preacher. The eldest sister's voice cut through the candle-lit barn like a blade, her green eyes blazing with exhaustion and something darker. Behind her, two younger women stood silent as tombstones, their faces pale in the flickering light. Samuel Thorne's weathered hands stilled on the deed papers scattered across the makeshift table. The ink wasn't even dry on the ranch documents, and already his carefully laid plans were crumbling like desert sand. Before we embark on this incredible journey together, I have a small, heartfelt favor to ask. Please subscribe to my channel, give this video a thumbs up. It costs you nothing but means the world to me. And let me know in the comments which beautiful corner of the world you're watching from. Your support truly makes all the difference. That wasn't, I never suggested. His voice, once commanding enough to fill a cathedral, now barely rose above a whisper. The middle sister stepped forward, her auburn hair catching the light. Then you don't understand what you've bought, do you? She laughed, but there was no humor in it. This isn't just land, Samuel Thorne. This is a debt, a curse, a burden that's been waiting 20 years for someone fool enough to claim it. The youngest sister finally spoke, her words soft as silk but sharp as winter wind. The previous owners all tried to separate us. They all failed. Her cornflower blue eyes met his directly. Every last one of them is buried in the north pasture. Samuel felt the familiar weight of his Colt 45 against his hip. But for the first time in years, iron couldn't solve his problem. He'd paid $3 for this ranch. $3 for 800 acres that should have cost 1,000. Now he understood why. The wind howled through the gaps in the barn walls, carrying the scent of sage and something else. Something that made his skin crawl. In the distance, a coyote's call rose and fell, mournful as a funeral dirge. He'd come to Wyoming territory to disappear, to bury the shame of his banishment from the church in Pennsylvania. He'd imagined building a new life on this remote ranch, far from the accusations and pointing fingers. Instead, he'd stumbled into something far more complicated than lost faith. The eldest sister, he still didn't even know their names, moved closer, her calico dress rustling in the silence. The question isn't whether you'll marry us, preacher. The question is whether you'll survive long enough to understand what this place demands. Thunder rumbled overhead, though no storm clouds had gathered when he'd ridden up that afternoon. The candles flickered as if touched by invisible breath. Samuel Thorne had faced down claim jumpers, outlaws, and his own demons, but nothing had prepared him for this moment. Three sisters bound by something beyond blood. A ranch sold for pennies because no man had been strong enough to claim it, and a debt that reached back decades into darkness. He looked at each woman in turn, seeing desperation masked as defiance, fear hidden behind fierce pride. Whatever curse held them to this place, whatever tragedy had made them prisoners on their own land, they were trapped just as surely as he now found himself. The deed crackled as his fingers tightened around it, and somewhere in the distance, something that wasn't quite a coyote howled again. What Samuel Thorne hadn't expected when he'd ridden into Devil's Canyon that morning was to find three women living like outlaws on land he'd just purchased. The sun was still climbing toward its merciless peak when he'd first spotted the ranch buildings. A weathered two-story house, a barn that had seen better decades, and several outbuildings that looked ready to surrender to the next strong wind. The property stretched across a valley surrounded by red rock formations that thrust up from the earth like the fingers of buried giants. He'd been riding for 6 days straight, ever since the confrontation with the church elders in Philadelphia. The memory still burned, Brother Marcus pointing an accusing finger, the congregation's gasps echoing off the cathedral ceiling, his own voice breaking as he tried to defend decisions that couldn't be defended. "You've forgotten your calling, Samuel. A man of God doesn't solve problems with a gun." But sometimes a gun was the only language the frontier understood. Samuel had learned that truth the hard way, ministering to mining camps and cattle towns where Sunday sermons competed with Saturday night gunfights. He'd saved more souls with his Colt than with his Bible, and the church had finally noticed. Now, dismounting near the ranch house, Samuel studied the property he'd bought sight unseen from a desperate seller in Cheyenne. $3 seemed too good to be true, and apparently it was. The front door opened before he could knock. The eldest sister stepped onto the porch, her green eyes taking his measure with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to sizing up threats. She was perhaps 25, with dark hair pulled back severely and a face that might have been beautiful if not for the hard lines round her mouth. "You must be the new owner," she said, her voice carrying the cultured accent of the East. "I'm Catherine Morrison. These are my sisters, Margaret and Ruth." The middle sister, Margaret, appeared beside her, all auburn curls and suspicious glances. She looked younger, maybe 22, with the kind of fierce intelligence that made smart men nervous. The youngest, Ruth, couldn't have been more than 19. Her cornflower blue eyes held an innocence that seemed out of place in this harsh landscape. "Samuel Thorne," he replied, touching the brim of his hat. "I wasn't told anyone was living here." Catherine's laugh held no warmth. "I imagine there is a lot Jeremiah Blackwood didn't tell you, such as why he sold 800 acres of prime grazing land for the price of a good horse." "Ma'am, I'm not looking for trouble. I paid fair and square for this land." "Fair?" Margaret stepped forward, her hands clenched into fists. "Nothing about this place has been fair for 20 years. Not since—" "Margaret!" Catherine's sharp tone cut her sister off. "The preacher doesn't need to hear old stories." Samuel's hand instinctively moved toward his gun belt, then stopped. These weren't outlaws or claim jumpers. They were women in trouble, and despite everything the church had said about his methods, he'd never drawn iron on innocence. "How did you know I was a preacher?" he asked. Ruth spoke for the first time, her voice soft as morning mist. "It's in the way you carry yourself, like you're used to people listening when you speak." She tilted her head, studying him with unsettling intensity. "But there's something else. You're running from something, too." The accuracy of her observation hit him like a physical blow. He'd ridden 300 miles to escape the weight of judgment and failure, and this slip of a girl had seen through him in minutes. "Ladies, I appreciate whatever difficulties you've faced, but I have legal claim to this property. I'm willing to discuss reasonable arrangements for you to relocate." "There are no reasonable arrangements," Catherine interrupted. "We can't leave. We've tried." Her voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "This place won't let us go." The wind picked up suddenly, howling through the canyon walls with a sound like tortured souls. Samuel's horse whinnied nervously, backing away from the house as if sensing some invisible danger. "What aren't you telling me?" Samuel demanded. The three sisters exchanged glances that spoke of shared secrets and old sorrows. Finally, Catherine straightened her shoulders like a soldier preparing for battle. "Welcome to Perdition Ranch, preacher. The last 4 men who own this land are buried in the north pasture, and we're the reason why." Nothing could have prepared Samuel for what Catherine Morrison told him next as they sat around the kitchen table in the ranch house that was now supposedly his. The interior was surprisingly well-maintained despite the ramshackle exterior, polished wood floors, clean windows, and furniture that spoke of Eastern refinement. But there was something unsettling about the way shadows seemed to linger in corners, even when the afternoon sun streamed through the windows. "Our father was Josiah Morrison," Catherine began, her hands wrapped around a chipped teacup like it was an anchor. "He bought this land in 1855, brought us here when I was 8, Margaret 6, and Ruth just 4. Our mother had died of consumption back in Ohio, and Papa thought the western air would heal our grief." Margaret picked up the story, her voice bitter as burnt coffee. "For 5 years it was paradise. Papa built up the ranch, married our stepmother Elena, and we were happy. Then the drought came." Samuel listened, noting how Ruth remained silent, her blue eyes fixed on something beyond the kitchen window that he couldn't see. The youngest sister hadn't said more than a dozen words since his arrival, but there was an awareness about her that made the hair on his neck stand up. "1860 was a brutal year," Catherine continued. "The cattle died, crops failed, and Papa became desperate. When Elena suggested certain measures to ensure the ranch's survival, he was too broken to refuse." "What kind of measures?" Samuel asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know. The sisters exchanged that look again, the one that spoke of shared burdens too heavy for words. Finally, Margaret answered, "Elena was from Mexico. Her grandmother had been what some called a bruja, a witch. She convinced Papa that the land needed a blood sacrifice to restore its fertility." Samuel's hand tightened around his own cup. He'd seen enough frontier superstition to know where this was heading, but the matter-of-fact way Margaret spoke made his skin crawl. They killed a dozen cattle at first, Catherine said, buried them in the north pasture according to Elena's rituals, and damned if the rains didn't come that very week. Papa was transformed overnight, Margaret added. The rational man who'd raised us disappeared. He became obsessed with Elena's magic, with the idea that the land was alive and hungry. Ruth finally spoke, her voice so quiet Samuel had to strain to hear her. It was hungry. We could feel it in our dreams. This great, empty thing beneath our feet, always wanting more. The temperature in the kitchen seemed to drop 10 degrees. Samuel had been a man of God long enough to recognize evil when it whispered in the shadows, and something about this place made his teeth ache with wrongness. "What happened to your parents?" he asked. "Elena convinced Papa that the land needed human blood to truly thrive," Catherine said, her voice flat as slate. "She said it had chosen our family, that we three sisters were the key to permanent prosperity." Margaret's fist slammed against the table, making the teacups jump. "So they tried to sacrifice us, their own children." Elena held me down while Papa raised the knife, babbling about ancient covenants and blood magic. "But the land had already chosen," Ruth whispered. "It didn't want us dead. It wanted us bound. When Papa brought that blade down, the earth opened beneath him, and Elena both, swallowed them whole." Samuel felt cold sweat break out across his forehead. "You're saying the ground ate them?" "Like it was quicksand," Catherine nodded. "One moment they were there, the next they were gone. But we could hear them screaming underneath our feet for days afterward. Sometimes on quiet nights, we still can." The rational part of Samuel's mind, the part trained in seminary and hardened by frontier pragmatism, wanted to dismiss their story as grief-induced delusion. But he'd seen enough unexplainable things in his years ministering to isolated communities to know that the world held darker corners than most people imagined. "And the other owners?" he asked. "They all tried to separate us," Margaret said. "Send us to different towns, different families. But we can't leave this place, and it won't let us be apart. Every man who's tried to break us up has ended up in that north pasture, one way or another." Samuel stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. Through the window, he could see his horse still pacing nervously near the fence, as if the animal sensed the wrongness that permeated this place. "Ladies, with all due respect, this sounds like—" A sound cut through his words, a low rumbling that seemed to come from beneath the floorboards. The teacups rattled on the table, and somewhere in the distance, he heard what sounded like voices moaning in underground caverns. Ruth looked directly at him, her innocent blue eyes suddenly ancient with knowledge no 19-year-old should possess. "The land remembers every drop of blood spilled on it, preacher. And it's been waiting 20 years for someone strong enough to break the curse, or become part of it." The realization that he might have bought more than just land hit Samuel like a kick from an angry mule as he explored the property that evening. He'd left the sisters in the house, needing time alone to process their impossible story. But everywhere he walked, evidence supported their claims in ways that made his rational mind reel. The north pasture was exactly where they'd said it would be, a stretch of unusually green grass about 50 yards behind the main house. What made Samuel's blood run cold was the pattern of the growth. Instead of random patches of fertility, the grass formed distinct rectangular shapes, each about 6 feet long and 3 feet wide, grave-sized rectangles, 4 of them. His boot hit something hard beneath the surface when he walked across one of the patches. Kneeling, he scraped away a thin layer of soil and found weathered wood, pieces of what had once been a coffin, now broken apart as if something had burst up through it from below. "You won't find bones." Samuel spun around, his hand moving instinctively to his Colt. Ruth stood 20 feet away, having approached with the silence of a ghost. In the dying light of sunset, she looked ethereal, like something not quite of this world. "How did you—" "I followed you." She moved closer, her bare feet making no sound on the grass. "I wanted to explain before you dig too deep. The others don't like to talk about what the land does to the bodies." "Ruth, you don't need to—" "It takes them," she interrupted, her voice dreamy and distant. "Pulls them down into the dark spaces beneath the rock. Elena taught us that blood feeds the earth, but it's the bones it really wants. Something about calcium making the soil rich. Samuel felt sick. You saw this happen? I see lots of things others don't. Always have, even before. She gestured vaguely at the ranch around them. Mama used to say I had second sight. Papa called it nonsense until the drought came, and suddenly everyone was listening to folk wisdom. The girl moved to stand beside him, so close he could smell the lavender soap she'd washed with. Despite the warmth of the evening, she radiated cold like winter morning. You're different from the others who tried to claim us, she said softly. Thomas Garrett wanted to send me to an asylum in Denver, said my visions weren't natural. Marcus Webb thought he could beat the strangeness out of us with his fists. Jackson Price, she shuddered. He had other ideas about what three isolated sisters might be good for. What happened to them? Ruth's smile was angelic and terrible. The land protected us. It always does. Thomas fell down the well, except the well is only 12 feet deep and his body was never found. Marcus got trampled by his own horses while they were standing perfectly still. And Jackson, she pointed toward a spot near the barn. Let's just say the earth opened up for him, same as it did for Papa and Elena. Samuel stared at the innocent-looking patch of ground she'd indicated. Ruth, are you telling me you and your sisters murdered these men? Murder? She looked genuinely confused. No, preacher. We never lifted a finger against any of them. We don't have to. Her blue eyes met his directly. The land loves us, you see. It won't let anyone hurt us or take us away from each other. A chill ran down Samuel's spine that had nothing to do with the desert evening air. What makes you think I'm different? Because you're already broken, Ruth said simply. The others came here thinking they could fix us, change us, make us into something we're not. But you, she reached out and touched his hand, her fingers ice cold despite the warm night. You understand what it's like to be cast out, to have people think you're something unnatural. The accuracy of her observation hit him harder than he cared to admit. The church elders had looked at him with the same mixture of fear and disgust he'd seen in the faces of townspeople when they spoke about the Morrison sisters. Your congregation threw you out because you weren't holy enough in the way they wanted, Ruth continued. Just like people avoid us because we're too strange for their comfort. We're both outcasts, Samuel Thorne. The difference is you chose to leave your family behind. We can't. The curse? Ruth's laugh was like silver bells in a tomb. Ian, is that what you think this is? Some sort of mystical punishment? She shook her head, looking suddenly older than her 19 years. This isn't a curse, preacher. It's love. Twisted, possessive, hungry love, but love all the same. She turned away from him, her pale dress ghostly in the gathering darkness. The land fell in love with us when we were children, and it won't let us go. Every man who's tried to separate us has learned what jealous love can do. As she walked back toward the house, her voice drifted back to him on the evening wind. The question is, Samuel Thorne, will you try to break us apart like the others? Or will you find a way to love all of us together? The ground beneath his feet seemed to pulse like a heartbeat, and somewhere in the distance, he could swear he heard the sound of something large and hungry stirring in the depths of the earth. Samuel's first night at Perdition Ranch taught him that some kinds of darkness went deeper than the absence of light. He'd set up his bedroll in the barn, unwilling to impose on the sisters by sleeping in the house, but more truthfully needing space to think. The building was sturdy despite its weathered appearance, with stalls for a dozen horses and a loft filled with sweet-smelling hay. But sleep wouldn't come. Every time he closed his eyes, he heard whispers rising from the earth below. Not quite words, but something that tugged at the edges of understanding. And beneath that, a rhythmic pulsing like a massive heartbeat, as if the ranch sat atop some sleeping giant. Around midnight, the barn door creaked open. Margaret appeared silhouetted against the starlight, carrying a steaming mug and wearing a wool shawl over her nightgown. Thought you might need this, she said, offering him the cup. The liquid inside was coffee, but with something else mixed in, herbs, that made the air smell like autumn leaves and distant rain. Much obliged, Samuel said, sitting up in his bedroll. Margaret settled herself on a hay bale across from him, her auburn hair loose around her shoulders. In the pale moonlight filtering through the barn windows, She looked younger than her 22 years. Can't sleep either, she asked. The sounds, do you hear them every night? Margaret nodded grimly. 20 years of it. You learn to live with ghosts when you have no choice. She pulled her shawl tighter. Ruth says you're different from the others. That maybe you'll understand. Understand what exactly? That we're not evil, Margaret said quietly. What happened to our parents, to the men who tried to claim us? We never asked for any of it. We were just children when Elena performed her ritual. The land chose us before we were old enough to choose anything for ourselves. Samuel sipped the coffee, feeling warmth spread through his chest. Ruth mentioned you've tried to leave before. Catherine made it as far as Denver once, about 10 years ago. Took it as a governess for a banker's family. Margaret's voice grew distant. She lasted 3 months before the dream started. Nightmares about Ruth and me dying while she was gone. Visions of the ranch burning. Voices calling her home. She came back more broken than when she left. And you? Have you tried? Margaret's laugh was bitter. I got to Colorado Springs. Made it 2 weeks working in a dress shop before I collapsed in the street, screaming about earthquakes that no one else could feel. She met his eyes. The land was calling me back, Samuel. I could feel it pulling at my bones, my blood. Every breath I took away from this place felt like drowning. The whispers from underground seemed to grow louder, as if responding to their conversation. Samuel noticed Margaret didn't seem to hear them, though her body tensed whenever the sound rose. What about Ruth? Has she ever tried to leave? Ruth is... Margaret paused, choosing her words carefully. Ruth is the strongest of us and the most fragile. She's never tried to leave because she knows what would happen if she did. Which is? She'd die, Margaret said simply. Not from the land calling her back, but from the complete severing of connection. Ruth isn't just bound to this place. She's part of it now. Has been since she was 7 years old and Elena's blood magic first awakened whatever sleeps beneath us. Samuel felt cold despite the warm coffee. Part of it? How? Margaret stood and moved to the barn window, staring out at the moonlit pasture. She dreams its dreams, sees through its eyes. When strangers approach the ranch, Ruth knows hours before they arrive. When the land is angry or hungry, Ruth feels it in her bones like other people feel weather changes. And Catherine? Catherine holds us together, Margaret replied. She's the practical one, the protector. If Ruth is the land's chosen vessel, and she hesitated, I'm the voice of its anger. But Catherine is the one who keeps us human. Without her, Ruth would disappear completely into whatever mystical connection she has, and I would become something even more dangerous than I already am. What do you mean dangerous? Margaret turned back to face him, and in the moonlight, Samuel saw something flicker across her features, something wild and primal that made every instinct he possessed scream warnings. When Thomas Garrett tried to drag Ruth away, I felt the land's rage rise through me like fire. The horses that trampled Marcus Webb, I called them. I didn't know how, didn't understand what was happening, but I could feel the earth's fury, and somehow she held up her hands, studying them as if they belonged to someone else. I could direct it. The coffee mug suddenly felt very heavy in Samuel's hands. You're saying you can control the land's power? Not control, channel. When one of us is threatened, when someone tries to break us apart, I become the instrument of the land's protection. I don't choose it, Samuel. It chooses me. A sound outside made them both freeze. Footsteps circling the barn, slow and deliberate. Margaret's entire body went rigid. Someone's here, she whispered. Samuel reached for his Colt, but Margaret caught his wrist, her grip surprisingly strong. Don't. If there's real danger, the land will handle it. If you interfere... Her green eyes held a warning that chilled him to the bone. The footsteps stopped directly outside the barn door, and then a voice called out, male, rough with travel and whiskey. Morrison girls, I know you're in there. Come out and let's discuss terms like civilized folks. Margaret's face went pale as moonlight. Jackson Price, she whispered, but he's dead. We buried him ourselves. The dead man's laughter echoed through the night air, and somewhere beneath their feet, something ancient and hungry began to stir. What emerged from the darkness outside the barn wasn't quite Jackson Price anymore, though it wore his face like an ill-fitting mask. The man who stepped into the doorway had Price's weathered features and gray-streaked beard, but his eyes were black holes that seemed to absorb moonlight. His clothes hung in tatters, stained with earth and something darker, and when he smiled, his teeth were too sharp and too many. "Miss Margaret," the thing said in Price's voice, though the words seemed to come from somewhere deep underground. "Been missing you something fierce down in the dark places." Margaret stepped protectively in front of Samuel, her hands clenched into fists. "You're not Jackson Price. He's been dead 3 years. "Dead?" The creature laughed, and the sound made the barn timbers creak ominously. "Death's just another kind of marriage, girl. The land takes what it loves and keeps it forever, just like it's going to keep all of you." Samuel rose slowly, his hand moving toward his Colt despite Margaret's earlier warning. But when his fingers touched the grip, the metal was so cold it burned his skin. "What do you want?" Samuel asked. The thing that had been Jackson Price turned its attention to him, those void black eyes boring into his soul. "Want? I want what I've always wanted, these three sisters, bound proper to the land that claimed them. They belong here, preacher man. Same as I do now. Same as you will, once you stop fighting what's inevitable." "Samuel, don't listen to him," Margaret whispered urgently. "It's not really Price. It's something else wearing his shape, something that comes up from the deep places when the land gets agitated." "Agitated?" The creature's grin widened impossibly. "Girl, I ain't agitated. I'm celebrating. Been 20 years since someone had the brass to buy this place, knowing what they were getting into. Most men who come here are fools or cowards, but this one," it gestured at Samuel with a hand that had too many joints. "This one's different. This one's got darkness in him already." Samuel felt ice in his veins. "What are you talking about?" "Oh, you know exactly what I'm talking about, preacher. All those men you sent to their maker with that iron on your hip. All those times you chose judgment over mercy, violence over forgiveness." The creature's voice dropped to a whisper that somehow filled the entire barn. "The church threw you out for being too much like me, too willing to spill blood for the greater good. That's not, ain't it?" The creature took a step closer, and Samuel could smell grave dirt and decay. "How many men have you killed, Samuel Thorne? How many times have you drawn that gun in the name of righteousness?" The questions hit harder than physical blows because Samuel knew the answers. 17 men over 8 years of frontier ministry, claim jumpers who threatened settlements, outlaws who terrorized mining busts, drunks who got violent during Sunday services. Each death justified at the time, each one another weight on his soul. "He's trying to get in your head," Margaret said sharply. "Don't let him." But the creature ignored her, focusing entirely on Samuel with predatory intensity. "The land sees what you really are, preacher. Sees the wolf dressed up in shepherd's clothing. That's why it's willing to make you a deal." "What kind of deal?" Margaret grabbed Samuel's arm. "Don't listen. Every man who's tried to bargain with this place ends up dead." The creature laughed. "Look at me, girl. Do I look dead to you, or do I look like someone who found a better way to live forever?" Samuel studied the thing more carefully and realized it was right. Despite the grave dirt and decay, despite the wrongness that radiated from it like heat, the creature wasn't exactly dead. It was something else, something that had made a bargain with whatever slept beneath Perdition Ranch. "What's the deal?" Samuel asked, ignoring Margaret's protests. "Simple. Stop fighting what the land wants. Accept that these three sisters belong here, bound together forever. Become their protector instead of their destroyer, and the land will give you power beyond anything you've ever imagined." "What kind of power?" The creature's grin became predatory. "The power to be judge, jury, and executioner without anyone questioning your methods. The power to cleanse the frontier of every evil that crosses your path, backed by forces older than civilization. The power to be the kind of minister this land really needs, one who serves justice with iron and fire." Samuel felt something deep inside him respond to the offer with hunger that frightened him. How many times had he wished for the authority to simply remove evil men from the world without legal constraints or church politics? "And if I refuse?" Then you'll join the others in the north pasture, the creature said, matter-of-factly. The land doesn't offer this choice to everyone, preacher. Most men who come here are too weak or too pure to handle the responsibility. But you, its black eyes gleamed, you've already walked the line between salvation and damnation. This just makes it official. A sound from outside made them all turn, Catherine's voice, calling urgently from the house. Margaret, Samuel, get away from the barn, now! The creature's expression shifted from persuasive to menacing. Time's up, preacher. The land's getting impatient, and when it gets impatient, things get unpleasant for everyone. The ground beneath their feet began to rumble ominously, and somewhere in the distance, Samuel could hear Ruth screaming, a sound of pure terror that cut through the night like a blade. Margaret was already running toward the door, but she stopped, long enough to look back at Samuel with desperate eyes. Whatever it offered you, it's lying. The power comes with a price that no man should pay. But as Samuel followed her into the night, he couldn't shake the feeling that the creature had seen something in him that even he didn't want to acknowledge, and that the choice it offered might not be as simple as good versus evil. The screaming from the house grew louder, and the earth beneath Perdition Ranch began to crack open like a hungry mouth. The scene Samuel discovered inside the ranch house would haunt him for the rest of his unnaturally long life. Ruth lay writhing on the kitchen floor, her body arched in impossible angles, while Catherine knelt beside her, trying desperately to hold her sister still. The youngest Morrison sister's eyes had rolled back in her head, showing only white, and when she spoke, it wasn't in her own voice. Deep, so deep. They're all down there, waiting, wanting. Ruth's words came in gasps between convulsions. Papa's calling from the bottom places. Elena's singing blood songs. The earth is opening. How long has she been like this? Samuel demanded, dropping to his knees beside Catherine. It started when that thing appeared outside, Catherine replied, her face pale with exhaustion. Ruth always feels it when the land gets agitated, but never this bad. It's like she's being pulled down into whatever connection binds us here. Margaret burst through the front door, her nightgown torn and dirt-stained. It's getting worse out there. The whole north pasture is cracking open, and I can hear voices coming from underground. All the men who tried to claim us, calling for us to join them. Ruth's back arched higher, and her voice changed again, this time speaking in what sounded like Spanish, with Elena's accent. Las hermanas pertenecen a la tierra les pertenece, el círculo debe cerrarse. What is she saying? Samuel asked. Catherine's face went ashen. The sisters belong to the earth. The earth belongs to them. The circle must be closed. She looked up at Samuel with desperation in her green eyes. It's Elena's voice. She's trying to complete the ritual she started 20 years ago. The house shuddered as if struck by an earthquake, and through the windows, Samuel could see unnatural lights dancing across the landscape, green and sickly, like foxfire in a graveyard. There has to be a way to break this connection, Samuel said, his medical training from seminary taking over. Some kind of counter-ritual, something to... You think we haven't tried? Margaret snapped. We've had 20 years to find a solution, preacher. Every traveling medicine man, every wise woman, every priest or pastor who's passed through, we've begged them all for help. Nothing works. Ruth's convulsions suddenly stopped, and she sat up with fluid grace that was completely unlike her normal movements. When she looked at Samuel, her cornflower blue eyes were solid black, just like the creature outside. Choose, Samuel Thorne, she said in Elena's voice. Accept the covenant or watch them suffer forever. The land grows tired of waiting. Ruth, fight this, Catherine pleaded. You're stronger than whatever has hold of you. But Ruth, or the thing speaking through Ruth, smiled with cruel satisfaction. The girl gave herself to us willingly years ago. She knows what she is, what all of them are, what you will be. Samuel felt the weight of his Colt against his hip, but what good was cold iron against supernatural forces? Still, his hand moved instinctively toward the weapon. Iron will not save you here, Ruth's possessed voice said, noticing the gesture. But it could serve you if you accept what is offered. Think of the evil you could cleanse from this world with the land's power behind your gun. Think of the justice you could bring to places where law cannot reach. The offer was seductive in ways that terrified Samuel. How many times had he watched guilty men walk free because of legal technicalities? How many innocents had suffered while he was bound by civilized restraints? Don't listen, Catherine said urgently. Whatever power it's offering comes with corruption. Look at what happened to Papa, to Elena. The land doesn't give gifts, it makes trades, and it always gets the better bargain. A new sound echoed through the house, laughter, deep and masculine, coming from the basement. Samuel's blood went cold as he recognized the voice. "That's my father," Catherine whispered. "Josiah Morrison. He's been down there for 20 years, and he's never stopped calling for us to join him." The floorboards began to warp and crack, as if something massive was pressing up from below. Margaret grabbed Samuel's arm, her grip strong enough to bruise. "The basement door," she said urgently. "It's sealed with iron bands and blessed salt. But if the land is truly awakening, those protections won't hold much longer." Ruth's head tilted at an unnatural angle, and Elena's voice became sweetly reasonable. "Why do you resist? Your sisters will be queens of the earth's power. They will want for nothing, fear nothing, outlive the kingdoms of men. All that is required is acceptance." "Acceptance of what?" Samuel demanded. "That some bonds cannot be broken, that some loves are stronger than death, that three sisters and the man who protects them can become something greater than human." A sound like breaking glass came from the basement, followed by footsteps on wooden stairs, slow, deliberate, ascending. Catherine met Samuel's eyes with desperate intensity. "He's coming. Papa's coming up from the deep places, and when he gets here, the choice will be made for all of us." Samuel looked at Ruth, still possessed and smiling that terrible smile. At Margaret, whose eyes were beginning to glow with that same unnatural light. At Catherine, fighting to remain herself, while the power of the land pressed against her will like a tide. Three sisters, bound by forces beyond mortal understanding. A ranch that demanded blood and souls in payment for its dark gifts. And Samuel Thorne, a failed preacher with too much violence in his past, standing at the crossroads between salvation and damnation. The footsteps from the basement grew louder, accompanied by Josiah Morrison's voice calling his daughter's names with paternal love twisted into something monstrous. Samuel's hand closed around his Colt's grip, knowing that some choices couldn't be unmade, and some lines, once crossed, led to places where even God's mercy might not reach. The basement door began to glow with hellish light, and the three Morrison sisters looked at him with eyes that held both desperate hope and terrible resignation. Time was running out, and whatever Samuel chose in the next few moments would determine not just their fate, but the shape of evil or good that would rule this cursed corner of the frontier for generations to come. The thing that had once been Josiah Morrison emerged from the basement like a nightmare given flesh, and Samuel understood why the sisters had never been able to escape their prison. Morrison was tall, taller than any man had a right to be, with limbs that seemed to stretch and flow like liquid shadow. His face retained enough human features to be recognizable, but his eyes were pits of starlight, and when he smiled at his daughters, his mouth opened too wide, revealing rows of teeth like broken glass. "My beautiful girls," he said in a voice like wind through cemetery trees. "Papa's been waiting so long for you to come home properly." Ruth was instantly on her feet, no longer possessed but moving with the fluid grace of sleepwalking. "Papa," she whispered, and started walking toward the creature. "No!" Catherine lunged forward, catching Ruth's arm. "That's not our father anymore. That's what the land made from what was left of him." But Morrison, or the thing wearing his face, laughed gently. "Catherine, my practical child, always so concerned with details. Does it matter what I am now as long as we can be together?" Margaret stepped between her sisters and their transformed father, her body radiating the same dangerous energy Samuel had sensed in the barn. "You killed our stepmother. You tried to sacrifice us when we were children. Why would we want to be with you?" "Because I learned the truth," Morrison replied, his impossible height making him loom over them all. "Elena was right about everything. The land chose our family for a reason. We were meant to become something greater than human." Samuel drew his Colt, though his hand trembled as he aimed it at Morrison's chest. "Stay back." Morrison turned those starlight eyes toward him with amusement. "Ah, the new claimant. Samuel Thorne, isn't it? The preacher who forgot how to forgive." The creature's smile widened impossibly. "Do you really think cold iron can hurt something that's become part of the earth itself?" "Maybe not," Samuel said, fighting to keep his voice steady. "But it might slow you down long enough for your daughters to get away." "Get away?" Morrison laughed, and the sound made the windows rattle. "My dear preacher, they've been trying to get away for 20 years, but love is stronger than distance. Need is stronger than fear. And the bond between the land and those it chooses is stronger than death." Ruth had stopped struggling against Catherine's grip, but her eyes remained fixed on her transformed father with terrible longing. "He's not wrong," she said softly. "I can feel it, what he's become. It's not evil, not exactly. It's just more. More than human, more than mortal, more than limited." "Ruth, no," Margaret pleaded. "Remember what happened to Elena. Remember what he tried to do to us." But Ruth's attention had shifted to Samuel, and her expression was heartbreakingly earnest. "You could understand, couldn't you? You've felt the limitations of being merely human. All those times you wanted to do more, be more, have the power to actually change things instead of just praying about them." Samuel felt the truth of her words hit him like a physical blow. How many sleepless nights had he spent wrestling with the inadequacy of conventional ministry? How many times had he wished for the authority to simply remove evil from the world by force? Morrison sensed his wavering resolve. "The land offers true power, Samuel, not the hollow authority of churches that cast out their servants for being too effective. Real power, the ability to cleanse evil from the earth with methods that actually work." "Show him, Papa," Ruth said suddenly. "Show him what we could become together." Morrison raised one impossibly long hand, and the air in the room shimmered like heat waves. Suddenly, Samuel could see visions flickering around them, images of what might be. He saw himself riding across the frontier with supernatural authority, his gun never missing, his judgment never questioned. Outlaws fled at the mention of his name. Corrupt officials crumbled to dust at his touch. Evil men simply disappeared, drawn down into the hungry earth that had become his ally. And the Morrison sisters were with him in these visions, no longer trapped but transformed into something magnificent. Catherine's practical wisdom had become strategic brilliance that could outthink any opponent. Margaret's protective anger had become a force of nature that could summon storms and earthquakes. And Ruth had become something almost divine, able to see into men's hearts and judge their worth with perfect accuracy. "We would be a family," Morrison continued, his voice honey-sweet with temptation, "bound not by the weakness of blood alone, but by shared purpose. You would marry my daughters, all three, as the land requires, and together you would bring true justice to a lawless world." "It's beautiful," Ruth whispered, her eyes reflecting the visions. "We would never be separated, never be alone, never be powerless again." But Margaret was shaking her head violently. "It's a lie. Every man who accepted that bargain became something monstrous. Look at Jackson Price, look at all the others. They thought they were choosing power, but they became servants to something hungry and alien." Morrison's expression darkened. "Margaret, my angry child, always so suspicious, so resistant to necessary change." His starlight eyes fixed on her with terrible intensity. "But the land is patient. It can wait for acceptance, or it can take what it needs by force." The floorboards beneath Margaret's feet began to crack and splinter. She jumped back, but tendrils of root and vine erupted from the gaps, reaching for her with grasping motion. Samuel fired without thinking, his bullet taking Morrison's center mass. The creature staggered but didn't fall. Instead, it looked down at the wound with mild interest as dark soil poured out instead of blood. "Iron stings," Morrison admitted, "but it cannot kill what is already one with the earth." He gestured and more roots burst through the floor, this time reaching for Catherine and Ruth. "Choose quickly, preacher. Accept the covenant willingly, or watch the land take what it wants by force." Catherine was pulling Ruth toward the door, but her sister was no longer resisting their father. She was reaching toward him with desperate longing. "I can hear it," Ruth whispered. The song the land sings. It's so beautiful, Samuel. It promises we'll never be alone again, never be afraid again, never be powerless again. Samuel raised his gun toward Morrison, but his hand was shaking too badly to aim properly. The visions of power and purpose the creature had shown him warred with his fading sense of right and wrong. Behind him, he could hear Catherine shouting something about iron and salt, but her voice seemed to come from very far away. The hunger of the land was pressing against his mind like a living thing, showing him possibilities that made his mouth water with desire. The choice was simple: accept the covenant and become something greater than human, or fight and watch innocent women suffer for his principles. But as Samuel looked at Ruth's face, so young, so desperate for connection, he realized the choice might not be as simple as power versus morality after all. Sometimes the greater evil was letting those you could protect suffer for the sake of abstract righteousness. The roots were reaching for all of them now, and Josiah Morrison's laughter echoed through the house like the sound of the earth itself rejoicing. What Samuel did next would define not only his own fate, but the very nature of justice on the American frontier for decades to come. Instead of accepting or rejecting Morrison's offer, he made a third choice, one that caught both the supernatural creature and his daughters completely off guard. "I propose a contest," Samuel announced, lowering his gun but not holstering it. "A test of worthiness. If the land truly wants to judge who's fit to protect these women, let it prove its wisdom." Morrison's impossible height diminished slightly, his starlight eyes narrowing with interest. "What kind of contest, preacher?" "You claim the land gives power to those worthy of it. I say it corrupts anyone who accepts its gifts." Samuel's voice grew stronger as his plan took shape. "So let's see what happens when someone refuses those gifts, but still chooses to protect what matters." Ruth had stopped reaching toward her transformed father, her cornflower blue eyes fixed on Samuel with growing understanding. "You want to face the land's trials without accepting its power?" "That's exactly what I want." Samuel looked at each sister in turn. "If I can protect you three without becoming something monstrous, then maybe there's another way. A way that doesn't require selling our humanity for strength." Margaret's expression shifted from desperation to cautious hope. "You'd risk your life on the principle?" "I've done stupider things for worse reasons," Samuel replied grimly. Morrison's laughter was like wind through a charnel house. "You have no idea what you're proposing, preacher. The land has tested many men. Those who refuse its gifts are crushed by forces they cannot comprehend or resist. Maybe, but those who accept its gifts become servants to something that devours everything human about them." Samuel met the creature's gaze directly. "If I fail, your daughters will know I died trying to find a third option. If I succeed—" He paused, letting the implication hang in the air. "If you succeed," Morrison finished, "you'll have proven that my bargain was unnecessary, that there was always another way." The creature's face twisted with something that might have been pain. "Very well, the land accepts your challenge, but understand the terms. You will face 3 trials. Each will test a different aspect of your worthiness. You may use only human strength, human wisdom, human weapons. No supernatural aid, no mystical protection." "And if he passes all 3, Catherine demanded. Morrison's form was already beginning to fade, becoming translucent as morning mist. "Then the covenant will be offered to him without corruption. He may choose to accept or refuse it, but the land will no longer compel the sisters to remain bound. They will be free to leave or to stay." Ruth stepped forward, her hand reaching towards Samuel but stopping just short of contact. "Why are you doing this? You barely know us." Samuel considered her question seriously. "Because 20 years ago, 3 little girls were caught up in something that wasn't their fault. Because 4 men before me tried to claim you like property instead of protecting you like people. And because—" He paused, struggling with words for something he barely understood himself. "Because sometimes the only way to break a curse is to prove it was never necessary in the first place." Morrison's voice echoed from everywhere and nowhere as his form dissolved completely. "The first trial begins at dawn. The land will test your resolve, Samuel Thorne. We shall see if human determination is stronger than superhuman power." The house fell silent except for the sisters' breathing and the distant sound of wind through the canyon walls. The supernatural lights dancing outside had vanished, leaving only normal starlight. Catherine moved to the window, peering out at the landscape. The ground has stopped cracking. Ruth's connection to the land seems quieter somehow. It's waiting, Ruth said softly. I can still feel it, but it's pulled back, like a cat watching to see what a mouse will do. She looked at Samuel with something that might have been admiration. You bought us time. Maybe hope. I haven't felt hope in so long that I'd forgotten what it was like. Margaret was checking the house for damage, her practical nature asserting itself now that the immediate supernatural threat had passed. What kind of trials do you think it means? Nothing good, Samuel replied honestly. But whatever they are, they'll be designed to tempt me into accepting the easy path. The land wants to prove that when push comes to shove, every man chooses power over principle. And you think you're different? Catherine asked, not unkindly but with genuine curiosity. Samuel thought about the 17 men he'd killed, about the church that had cast him out for being too willing to use violence, about the darkness in his own heart that had responded to Morrison's offer with hunger. No, he said finally, I'm not different. I'm probably worse than most men who've tried to claim this place. But that might be exactly why I have a chance to succeed where they failed. I don't understand, Ruth said. The other men came here thinking they were good enough to save you without being corrupted. They were wrong because they didn't understand their own capacity for darkness. Samuel looked at his hands, remembering the weight of his gun, the lives he'd taken. I know exactly what I'm capable of. I know how easily I could become something monstrous. That knowledge might be the only thing that can keep me human when the trials begin. Catherine moved closer, studying his face in the dim light. You are going to try to protect us without accepting any power that would make protection easier. I'm going to try to prove that sometimes the hard way is the only way that doesn't damn your soul in the process. Outside, the first faint hints of dawn were beginning to touch the eastern horizon. Samuel could feel something gathering in the earth beneath his feet. Not malevolent exactly, but anticipatory, like a teacher preparing to give a particularly difficult exam. Ruth suddenly grabbed his hand, her fingers ice cold but trembling with emotion. Samuel, what if you can't do it? What if human strength isn't enough? He looked at her, so young, so desperate for freedom, so terrified of hope after 20 years of disappointment. Then he looked at Margaret with her fierce protectiveness, and Catherine with her quiet strength. Then at least you'll know someone tried, he said simply, and maybe that'll be enough to inspire the next man who comes along to find a better way. The sun was rising now, painting the sky the color of fresh blood. Somewhere in the distance, Samuel could hear the land itself stirring to wakefulness, preparing to test whether one man's refusal to compromise his humanity was stronger than supernatural power. The first trial was about to begin, and Samuel Thorne had never been more afraid or more determined in his life. The first trial came with the sunrise, and it tested Samuel in ways he hadn't anticipated. He was checking his gear on the front porch when the Morrison sisters emerged from the house, dressed for travel. Catherine carried a packed satchel, Margaret had supply bundled in a wool blanket, and Ruth clutched a small valise that looked like it contained all her worldly possessions. What's this? Samuel asked. Catherine's green eyes were steady but sad. The trial has begun. We can feel it. The land is releasing us just for today. We can leave Perdition Ranch and go anywhere we choose. Samuel's stomach dropped. And you're going? We have to, Margaret said, though her voice was thick with emotion. Don't you see? This is the test. The land is giving us what we've wanted for 20 years, freedom. The question is whether you'll try to stop us. Ruth stepped forward, her cornflower blue eyes bright with unshed tears. Every man who claimed this place before tried to control where we went, what we did, who we were. They said it was for our protection, but it was really about ownership. This isn't about ownership, Samuel protested. If you leave now, you might not come back. The land might decide the trial is over and trap us here forever. Yes, Catherine interrupted. We know, but that's exactly why this is a test. Will you let us choose our own fate, even if it means risking everything? Samuel felt the weight of impossible choice settle on his shoulders. Let them go, and they might die or disappear forever. try to stop them, and he'd become just another man trying to control them for their own good. "Where will you go?" he asked quietly. "Denver," Catherine replied. "I still have friends there from when I tried to leave before. We can start over, maybe find normal lives. And if the supernatural connection follows you, if you collapse again like last time," Margaret's jaw set stubbornly, "then at least we'll have made on our own terms. At least we'll have chosen our fate instead of having it chosen for us." Samuel looked at each woman, these three sisters who had been prisoners of forces beyond their control for 2 decades. Ruth, barely 19, who had never known life beyond this cursed ranch. Margaret, whose anger and protectiveness had been twisted into something supernatural. Catherine, who carried the weight of responsibility for her younger sisters like a millstone around her neck. They deserved the chance to choose. "Take my horse," he said finally. "She's strong enough to carry all three of you, and she knows the way to Colorado Springs." Ruth made a small sound of surprise. "You're letting us go?" "I'm letting you choose," Samuel corrected. "There's a difference, Reese." Catherine stepped closer, her voice soft with something that might have been gratitude. "What if we don't come back? What if this is goodbye?" Samuel met her eyes directly. "Then I'll know I helped three women find their freedom, and that'll have to be enough." But even as he said the words, he could feel something watching from the shadows of the ranch house, something that radiated amusement at his choice. The land wasn't done with him yet. Margaret surprised him by stepping forward and briefly touching his hand. "Thank you. For the first time in 20 years, we get to find out who we are when we're not defined by this place." They were mounted and riding away within minutes, Catherine handling the reins with Margaret behind her and Ruth riding pillion. Samuel watched them disappear into the morning haze, feeling like he'd just torn out his own heart. The silence that followed was absolute. Then, as if summoned by his solitude, a new voice spoke from behind him. "Well, well, look what we have here." Samuel spun around to find three men approaching from the direction of the barn, strangers, armed and dangerous, with the look of professional troublemakers. The leader was a tall man with cold eyes and a badge pinned to his vest that Samuel didn't recognize. "Gentlemen," Samuel said carefully, his hand moving instinctively toward his Colt. "Something I can help you with?" "Name's Carson," the leader said, spitting tobacco juice into the dirt. "I'm a bounty hunter, and I got word there's three women hiding out here who are wanted for questioning in connection with several deaths." Samuel's blood ran cold. "What kind of deaths?" "The mysterious kind," Carson replied with a grin that showed too many teeth. "Seems like men have a habit of disappearing after they get involved with the Morrison sisters. Local law wants to have a chat with them about it." "They're not here," Samuel said flatly. "Oh, I can see that. Tracks leading east. 3 riders on 1 horse. Fresh as this morning's bread." Carson's companions spread out, flanking Samuel. "Question is, where'd they go, and how long ago?" Samuel realized with growing horror what was happening. The first trial wasn't about letting the sisters choose. It was about what he'd do when that choice put them in mortal danger. "I don't know what you're talking about," he lied. Carson's laugh was ugly. "Preacher, I can track a butterfly through a thunderstorm. Those women left maybe an hour ago, heading toward Denver most likely. Now you can tell me exactly which route they took and save us all some time. Or," the bounty hunter's hand moved to his gun and his companions followed suit. "Or what?" Samuel asked, though he already knew the answer. "Or we'll beat the information out of you, then track them down anyway. Either way, those women are going to face justice for what they've done." Samuel's mind raced. The Morrison sisters had been gone an hour, enough time to get a good head start, but not enough to reach safety. If these bounty hunters were half as skilled as Carson claimed, they'd catch up to 3 women on 1 horse within a few hours. But if Samuel fought here, now he might die without warning the sisters at all. "There's a problem with your plan," Samuel said quietly. "What's that?" "Those women didn't kill anyone. They were victims, not criminals." Carson's expression didn't change. "Maybe so, but they're worth $500 each, dead or alive, and I got bills to pay. So you can cooperate or get out of the way. Your choice." Samuel looked at the 3 armed men, calculated odds and distances, felt the familiar weight of his Colt against his hip. He could probably take one, maybe two, if he was lucky. But the third would get him, and then the sisters would face these killers with no warning at all. Unless, "Gentlemen," Samuel said, slowly raising his hands, "I believe we can work out a deal." The land beneath his feet seemed to pulse with anticipation, as if it knew exactly what choice he was about to make and how much it would cost him. The first trial was about to become a test of whether one man's sacrifice could be worth more than supernatural power. What Samuel did next would forever change how he understood the difference between justice and vengeance. "The deal is simple," he told Carson, keeping his hands visible but ready. "You want information about the Morrison sisters. I want guarantees they'll be treated fairly if you find them." Carson's laugh was sharp as broken glass. "Preacher, you ain't in a position to negotiate. We got you outnumbered 3-1. "Do you?" Samuel's voice carried a quiet confidence that made all three bounty hunters tense. "See, the thing is, I know exactly what you men are. Carson, you're wanted in Texas for murder. Killed a family of homesteaders and made it look like the Indian Raiders. Wilson there has a price on his head in Colorado for what he did to those girls in Denver. And Pike," Samuel's eyes fixed on the third man, "Pike used to wear a badge in Kansas until they found out he was selling information to the James gang." The three men exchanged glances, their hands moving closer to their weapons. "How do you," Carson began, "know all that? Because I make it my business to know who the real criminals are." Samuel's hand inched toward his Colt. "The Morrison sisters never hurt anyone who didn't deserve it. But you three, you're exactly the kind of evil I spent 8 years cleaning off the frontier." "Big talk from one man against three," Wilson sneered. "One man with God's righteous anger backing his play," Samuel corrected. "And the knowledge that every breath you waste is another minute those innocent women get closer to safety." Carson's eyes narrowed. "You're bluffing. Ain't no preacher alive got the sand to face 3 guns." Samuel smiled, and it was not a pleasant expression. "Gentlemen, I was expelled from the church for being too quick to send sinners to their maker. What do you think that tells you about my commitment to justice?" The standoff stretched like a taut wire, 4 men in a deadly circle, each waiting for someone else to make the first move. Samuel could feel time slipping away. Every second he spent talking was another second the sisters got closer to Denver, but also another second these killers might decide to bypass him entirely. Then Wilson made the mistake of glancing toward the eastern horizon, as if calculating pursuit routes. Samuel drew and fired in one fluid motion, his bullet taking Wilson's center mass before the man could clear leather. He was diving sideways as Carson and Pike drew their weapons, rolling behind a water trough as the bullets whined through the space he'd occupied. "Son of a—" Carson's curse was cut short as Samuel's second shot took him in the shoulder, spinning him around and sending his gun flying. Pike had better reflexes. His bullet splintered the wood of the trough inches from Samuel's head, forcing the preacher to keep low. But Samuel had fought men in terrain a lot worse than an open ranch yard, and he knew how to use every scrap of cover. He rolled again, coming up beside the corner of the house with a clear shot at Pike's position. But instead of firing immediately, he called out, "Pike, you still got time to ride away from this. Wilson's dead. Carson's bleeding out. No shame in cutting your losses." "Go to hell, preacher." Pike's voice was high with fear and adrenaline. "You killed my partner." "I killed a man who raped and murdered innocent women," Samuel corrected. "Question is, do you want to die defending his memory, or do you want to live to find honest work?" Pike's answer was another wild shot that went wide by 3 feet. Samuel sighed and put a bullet through Pike's heart with surgical precision. The bounty hunter dropped without another word, his gun falling from nerveless fingers. Carson was on his knees, clutching his wounded shoulder and cursing steadily. You're no preacher. Preachers don't shoot men down like dogs." "No," Samuel agreed, walking over to stand above the wounded man. "A preacher would probably try to save your soul, offer you redemption, pray for your forgiveness." He thumbed back the hammer on his Colt. "Lucky for you, I'm not a preacher anymore." But instead of pulling the trigger, Samuel holstered his weapon. "What?" Carson started. "You're going to ride back to whatever town hired you," Samuel said quietly. You're going to tell them the Morrison sisters are dead, killed in a cabin fire, bodies too burned to recover. You're going to collect your blood money and disappear. And if I ever see your face again, if I ever hear of you hunting innocent women, I will find you and finish what we started here." Carson stared at him in disbelief. "You're letting me live?" "I'm giving you the chance to choose who you want to be," Samuel replied. "The same choice I gave those women this morning. The difference is, they deserved it." Carson struggled to his feet, swaying from blood loss. "This ain't over." "Yes, it is." Samuel's voice carried absolute finality. "Wilson and Pike chose their fate when they decided to hunt innocent women for money. You can choose different, or you can join them in the ground. Your decision." The wounded bounty hunter stumbled toward his horse, casting fearful glances back at Samuel. Within minutes, he was riding hard toward the south, leaving a trail of blood drops in the dust. Samuel stood alone among the bodies, the familiar weight of fresh violence settling on his shoulders like a shroud. 3 more men dead by his hand, 3 more souls on his conscience. The church elders had been right about one thing. He did solve problems with a gun more easily than with prayer. But as he looked east toward Denver, toward 3 women who now had a better chance of reaching safety, he couldn't bring himself to regret his choices. The land beneath his feet was completely silent now. No whispers, no pulse of supernatural hunger. The first trial was over, and Samuel had passed, not by accepting power, but by using the power he already possessed to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. The sun was climbing toward noon when he finished burying Wilson and Pike in the south pasture, well away from the cursed ground where the previous owners lay. As he worked, he found himself wondering what the second trial would bring and whether his humanity could survive it. But for now, 3 sisters were free to choose their own fate, and 2 evil men would never threaten anyone again. In Samuel Thorne's moral universe, that was as close to righteousness as a man like him was likely to get. The second and third trials came not as dramatic confrontations, but as quiet choices that tested the very core of who Samuel Thorne chose to be. The second trial arrived 3 days after the bounty hunters, in the form of a letter delivered by a nervous postal rider. Inside was an official document from the territorial government, a deed transfer that would make Samuel the legal owner of not just Perdition Ranch, but 3 adjoining properties whose previous owners had died under mysterious circumstances. The combined land would make him one of the wealthiest men in Wyoming territory. All he had to do was sign his name and accept that wealth sometimes came with dark origins. Samuel burned the letter without signing it. The third trial was harder because it came disguised as mercy. Ruth returned alone on the 4th day, her cornflower blue eyes bright with tears and terrible knowledge. "Catherine collapsed in Denver," she said simply. "Just like before. Margaret stayed with her, but the doctors don't think she'll survive being separated from the land much longer. They sent me back to ask," she paused, struggling with words, "to ask if the offer still stands. The covenant, the power to save her." Samuel looked at this young woman who had never known freedom, whose sister was dying because they had dared to hope for normal lives. The supernatural solution was right there, waiting. Accept the land's bargain, become something more than human, and save Catherine's life with powers beyond mortal comprehension. Instead, he saddled his horse. "What are you doing?" Ruth asked. "Going to Denver," Samuel replied. "If Catherine is dying, then she should die among people who love her, in a place she chose to be, not trapped here by forces beyond her control." "But the land has no claim on any of you anymore," Samuel said firmly. "That was the bargain. I passed the trials without accepting corruption. You're free to choose, all of you." Ruth stared at him in wonder. "You'd give up everything? The power, the land, the chance to become something greater than human?" Samuel thought about the visions Morrison had shown him. Unlimited authority, supernatural justice, the ability to cleanse evil from the world with methods that actually worked. Then he thought about Catherine lying in a Denver hospital bed, choosing to die free rather than live enslaved. "Some things are more important than power," he said simply. They rode to Denver together, racing against time and Catherine's failing health. Margaret met them at the hospital with tears streaming down her face. "She's been asking for you," she told Samuel. "Both of you, I think." I think she's been waiting. Catherine Morrison died at sunset on a Tuesday, holding her sister's hands while Samuel read from the Psalms. Her last words were, "Thank you for letting us choose." But here's the thing about breaking 20-year-old curses. Sometimes the victory doesn't look like what you expected. Ruth and Margaret returned to Perdition Ranch with Samuel, not as prisoners, but as partners. The land's supernatural hunger had died with the covenant's rejection, leaving behind simply good grazing ground that happened to need a lot of work. They weren't bound by mystical forces anymore, but by something stronger. The choice to build a family from shared loss and mutual respect. Samuel never became the supernatural enforcer of frontier justice he might have been. Instead, he became something rarer, a man who chose difficult righteousness over easy power, and found that sometimes that was enough. The ranch prospered through honest work. Ruth discovered she had a gift for healing that came from knowledge rather than magic. Margaret's fierce protectiveness translated into business sense that made their cattle operation one of the most successful in Wyoming territory. And Samuel learned that redemption wasn't about being forgiven for past sins, but about choosing each day to be better than the man you were yesterday. On quiet evenings when the wind blew through the canyon walls with sounds like voices, Ruth would sometimes look toward the north pasture where her parents lay and say, "Do you think they would have been proud?" And Samuel, understanding that some questions have no good answers, would simply reply, "I think they would have been grateful you survived to ask." The Morrison sisters never married, not because they were bound by supernatural compulsion, but because they had learned the value of bonds freely chosen over those imposed by law or custom or magic. Samuel stayed with them as protector, partner, and friend, building the kind of family the frontier needed but rarely allowed. Years later, when travelers asked about the success of Perdition Ranch and the unusual household that ran it, Samuel would tell them the truth, that some curses break not through power, but through the simple human refusal to accept that evil is stronger than love. It wasn't the ending anyone might have expected from a story that began with blood magic and supernatural bargains. But it was the ending that proves sometimes the most powerful choice is the decision to remain human in a world that offers 1,000 ways to become something else. And if that's not redemption, it's at least close enough for a broken preacher and two sisters who learned that freedom is worth any price except your soul. Final call to action. If this story of choosing the harder path over the easier power spoke to something in your heart, I'd be honored if you'd share it with others who might need to hear that sometimes the most courageous choice is simply refusing to compromise who you are, even when the world offers you everything you think you want in exchange for your humanity.